Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday to you all, and welcome to the Fashion and Sustainability Summit 2020 series. The Fashion and Sustainability Summit is brought to you by Fashion Dex and LIM College. My name is Andrea Kennedy, and I'm fortunate enough to work with both organizations and welcome you all today to week 11. And we want to, before we introduce our amazing speakers today, I want to really thank the generous sponsors who help make this series come to be each week, which is Eco Life Yarns by Belle de Lorenz and Candor Textiles and the Accessories Council. So please check them all out online. And today is week 11, where we're going to dig deep into a lively conversation on social compliance and ensuring ethical practices across your fashion supply chains. And we're so honored and delighted and thankful that we have amazing speakers today, including Avedis Seferian, President and CEO of RAP from Virginia. We have Simone Cipriani, the CTA of Ethical Fashion Initiative, joining us from Geneva. Fatima Anwar, founder and CEO of Ethical and Sustainable Sourcing, as well as founder and host of Straight from the Source podcast, joining us from Brooklyn, I think. And today's moderator is Nancy Miller, Chair of Fashion Merchandising at LIM College, joining us from New York, and who will be joining as co-moderator is Riley Bott, Fashion Merchandising and Sustainability student from LIM College, I think also joining us from Brooklyn. And then fielding all of your questions throughout will be Austin Sierra, also a fashion merchandising major and sustainability student from LIM College. So thank you so much. Let's start with Avedis Seferian, and I'm gonna give the mic to you.
All right, well, thank you, Andrea. It is a real pleasure to be with you all here. I've enjoyed my engagements on this forum in the past and had a wonderful time with Nancy in LA when we could all get together and do so in person. Can't do that this time, but we'll settle for something of a close approximation at the very least in terms of having a good conversation. I've been asked to introduce myself very briefly, just to give you a context with regards to folks who might not be familiar with RAP. So let me do that in a couple of minutes. So what is RAP? RAP is Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. We are the world's largest independent factory-based certification program that is focused on this industry: apparel, footwear, sewn products writ large. There are several other peer organizations that do social compliance auditing, but we're the only ones that are dedicated to this industry. And in that regard, as I said, we are the largest in this space. Our scope with regards to industry may be limited, but geographically it is not. The W stands for worldwide. We inspect and certify factories all over the world. The way we describe ourselves is as an objective nonprofit team of global social compliance experts. That's who we are. What we do is promote safe, lawful, humane, and ethical manufacturing around the world. That's our mission. And how we do it is through certification. That's our prime sort of service. We inspect factories and certify that they meet conditions, and education. So events like this, opportunities to engage with audiences to spread the gospel of compliance, such as it were. Our philosophy is to work with industry. We believe that that's where the leverage is to make change. And so you want to engage with brands and buyers and factories and associations, and we want to position ourselves as the program of choice for such industry associations. And for example, here in the US, we are the American Apparel and Footwear Associations, the AAFA's official CSR partner. I won't go into detail here, but this is what the 12 principles of RAP cover. This is what our audits will check against to make sure factories are meeting all of these requirements. And you can see they really draw from the standard well that you get in this space, the core ILO conventions, and a few additional value adds in there. Next slide. I mentioned that we are worldwide. I just wanted to demonstrate that. So we're headquartered in the US, but we have staff on the ground to cover all of these regions. We have additional actual offices in Bangladesh and Hong Kong, and then full-time staff to cover Latin America, in Europe, in India, and in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Next slide. Just to give you some numbers to back up my claim that we're the largest body, you can see the 2019 figures for participation with RAP. We received a little over 3,000 applications last year. And as of this point in time, late third quarter, there are almost 2,700 factories employing just about 2.7 million workers in 41 countries to be exact. And I think actually that was the last slide. So thank you for that. That's just a brief introduction, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and engaging with everybody else on this panel.
Thank you so much, Avedis. And next we have Simone Cipriani from the Ethical Fashion Initiative.
Hello, everybody. I am a UN officer. I founded and now I manage a program of the UN which is called the Ethical Fashion Initiative. We are two or three things. One, we are a supply chain of artisans from very marginalized communities in Africa, in Afghanistan, often in countries affected by war, by conflict, or by conditions of extreme poverty. We are a supply chain because we enable these artisans to be part of the international supply chains of international brands and distributors in the industry of fashion, and also sometimes in lifestyle and furniture. We work in several African countries like this, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Benin, in Uganda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Kenya, in Afghanistan. And we manage this supply chain through our own social enterprises. Every country has a social enterprise that coordinates the work of a large number of cooperatives of artisans. Normally, the social enterprise belongs to these cooperatives of artisans or to some local impact investors, and is co-managed by us until the impact investors and the local artisans take over from us. The first social enterprise we created 10 years ago is now an independent company in Kenya. So that's the first area of work. The second area of work is about mentoring emerging designers from these places and creative talents from these places. We have an accelerator for new designers. We are mentoring now 6 African brands. We have also a talent show and methodology for creatives, new creative talents from Africa, which is now functioning in Uganda, in Ivory Coast, in Burkina Faso, and in Nigeria. We also, as we have this and we nurture a talent and creativity from the places where we are, we also have some structured collaboration with the arts. So we are also producers of a theatrical play that brings together all the skills and the capacities of the artisans that we have all over the places where we work, and of creatives and directors there. This theatrical play is called From Kabul to Bamako, in French, the Kabul à Bamako, and it's a brand used also by the European Union to produce now a TV series, which has been announced at the Cinema Festival of Venice a week ago. We also work in producing films, documentaries, and all this kind of stuff, and also in mentoring contemporary artists. Why? Because by bringing together creative talents and manufacturing, and I repeat, manufacturing happens in extremely marginalized communities, we recreate those linkages of collaboration that regenerate the social capital of the societies where we work. War-torn countries are countries where social capital has been disrupted. Social capital is the capacity to work together, to have trust in your fellow citizens. By doing this, we recreate that. That's the reason why we also work in some difficult files of the world of today, such as migration, informal migration from Africa towards Europe. We have a center for migrants in Italy that teaches migrants skills of the industry of fashion and all the rest. We also work through our compliance system and all the rest, but we'll speak about this over this webinar.
That was perfect. Next, we have Fatima Anwar from Ethical and Sustainable Sourcing.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to Andrea and team for having me here. I am so honored to be among such esteemed company, and I am really looking forward to this conversation. As Andrea may have mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Ethical and Sustainable Sourcing. Our core mission is to connect apparel brands primarily based out of North America, but also in Europe, with manufacturers in South Asia who tend to be sustainable, as well as ethical, as well as price competitive. What we mean by sustainable is cleaner supply chains in their raw material procurement, is also essentially investing in your equipment, in your facilities to make it greener, to have water treatment plants, for instance, for some of the larger ones. For the smaller ones, it's really focusing on getting better materials and sourcing more regionally to cut down on carbon footprint overall. The ethical part is actually where I started my company. It's the grounding of my company, so to speak. And I'm very passionate about it, which is essentially ensuring that workers are safe, workers have a voice, they have the right to unionize, that they have great working facilities, and that there are lots of other tertiary benefits that really help create a community, because any of these manufacturing facilities, if you're mid-sized to large, can host anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 workers easily. So it sort of becomes my job to create these bridges and linkages between the North American clients as well as manufacturers in all of these different parts of the world, in terms of culture, in terms of compliance, and also in terms of safety and brand health. Now, the last part of my job is really sort of self-appointed. Well, all of it is a little self-appointed, but this part especially. So when I started this job, I really realized that there isn't as much information out there that I would like on supply chain, on compliance, on just, a really high level overview on how manufacturing really works. So as a result of that, I created my podcast. It's called Straight from the Source, and we're on various platforms, and it's linked on my website. And the goal of that podcast is really to take supply chains and to demystify supply chains. And we bring in really amazing experts from whom not only I learn, but hopefully our listeners can really learn something and take that step towards better business practices. So overall, I would say my ethos and who I am is to really help empower business leaders, whether you are emergent, nascent, or very seasoned, to take steps towards creating better business practices, cleaner business practices, and a business practice that is inclusive of all members of the team, because that's what we are.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And now I'm going to hand it over to Nancy Miller. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andrea. I would like to say how pleased I am to be here with you today. And our conversation is so important for a couple of reasons. It helps to shape what we teach at the college. It helps to inform our curriculum. And actually, it helps to prepare our students to become future leaders and change agents like all of you are. So thank you so much. I'm also happy to be here with Riley Bott, who is going to be co-moderating with me, and we'll be alternating the questions that we have for you. So I'll start, and Riley will follow up. So the first question, and we'll ask all of you, Avedis, I'll start with you actually, is about social compliance. Can you share a little bit about how WRAP works towards achieving social compliance?
Okay, well, that could take up the entire hour, Nancy, but
well, you're on the clock here.
I'll give it to you in a nutshell. I think the core idea is that if, as Fatima said, if you want to demystify supply chains, and these are really complicated systems that we've developed over the years, you have to understand that the primary mode of making stuff in the branded world has shifted away from the post-war years, where a brand typically made stuff in facilities that they owned and operated, to a much more outsourcing focused model today, which means that the brands that are making these things don't have the degree of visibility into those production facilities that they used to have back then, but they are still responsible for making sure that the working conditions in those facilities are meeting the generally accepted standards that they want to see in their supply chains. And so this creates an important due diligence function that has to be credibly conducted, ideally by independent bodies like WRAP. And that's really what the social compliance function is. We go and look at these factories, I put up the 12 principles. Those are just the top level descriptors of what we look at. There's a lot of detail behind them, thorough audit protocol that looks not only for conditions on the day of the audit, but to ensure that there are management systems in place to ensure those conditions remain in place after the auditors have left. And if they are indeed meeting these standards, we are able to validate that, certify that, and that becomes an independent verification that the factory can then show a prospective buyer as evidence that they are indeed meeting the standards, and that the buyer can be comfortable that they've done their due diligence and are engaging a worthy vendor as their supplier in their supply chain. So I'll leave it at that, generally speaking. I mean, we can go into details of what these audits involve. They are really deep on-site inspections that look at all the facility, look at documents and payroll and all kinds of policies, talk to managers, spend a lot of time talking to workers. So there's a lot of information gathering that goes behind it, and a lot of quality control that sits behind the whole system. But in a nutshell, that's how it all works.
Thank you. Thank you. Fatima, I'm going to turn that question to you. Please share your thoughts on some social compliance.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, I think before I really dive into the subject, it is really important to be said that my area of expertise is Bangladesh. That's where I'm originally from. And I think it's really important to remember the incidents of 2013. We had this horrific incident of Rana Plaza. And I think given this audience, you're all probably quite familiar. What you haven't heard is, except for maybe Avedis, I'm sure you're very familiar. But what many of you may not have heard is the media follow-up of what has happened since. So we're now almost 7 years post to that incident. And business is like the reverse of dog years. And there's a lot that's happened and a lot of things that have been put in place by different governing bodies and compliance bodies to really help streamline social compliance, because that was really our area of weakness. The reason why that happened is because we had all of this global attention, and without real change, we would have lost our biggest export market, and the country just could not survive that. So as a result, I would say today we have some of the best line conditions. How have we gotten there is the question, right? So when I go into a manufacturing facility, one of the first things that I will look at are their certifications and their compliance. So RAP is actually one of them. We see that for maybe some of our mid-sized to larger manufacturing facilities, but with RAP, I also need to see this other certification called Accord. Accord was created really in partnership with European clients, constituencies, North American clients, other different groups, and they came together, created a system where they look at the structural integrity of your building, and then they also help train workforce on different things like fire safety, etc. So the Accord is going to be my first place that I look. I look at all of their compliance reports. That gives me a really high level bird's view of what's really going on in the facility. Then we will send in our own workers, and we all speak Bengali. I think everyone who has offices there, we all speak Bengali, and we'll talk to some of the folks there. We'll talk to management. We'll really go and look at what's happening on the floor. Nothing really beats that one-on-one, face-to-face with the management as well as with the team on the ground. There's no such thing that's a replacement for it. And then that's the baseline. Then we look at other things, right? I want to make sure that in whatever facility I'm working with, they have the right to unionize within the facility, because you can just have so many people, tens of thousands, well, at least thousands of people in a facility. And then I also like to see what additional thing are you doing? Are you helping them set up bank accounts, or are you helping them get their money through mobile apps? Are you streamlining the process? Are you helping them on some extent with something to do with medical, with something to do with healthcare or schooling for your children? And when a lot of these boxes are checked, we're willing to move forward. What I want to really pause and emphasize here is that we're not looking for perfect. That perfect is going to come with all of us working together. And as a result of more money, more business, not a nonprofit, but a for-profit, really grounded entity that's going to help all of us grow and modernize. There are so many tertiary benefits that comes from it. So I know that was a slightly longer answer, but I hope that helps.
No, it's so important. It's so important to hear. Thank you. Thank you. So Simone, I'll now turn that question to you, please.
Thank you. As you know, I didn't say this before, but we are at the Secretariat also of the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. The UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion is the alliance of all the agencies of the UN that work in a way or another in sustainable fashion. We take care of the social compliance in the Secretariat, and the colleague of UNEP, the environmental agency of the UN, in the Secretariat takes care of the environmental part. So I co-chair this alliance until end of 2021. And that's why social compliance also is so important for us in our operations. First of all, we have a code of conduct, which is obviously with the same points that Avedis rightly highlighted before, because they are inspired and they are modeled on the International Labour Office and on all the main labor and social standards. They are modeled also in such a way to respect human rights. So the guideline, the general inspiring guideline is the Human Rights Bill. All this said, we also have a particular focus on living wage. Living wage is not only a system to calculate a good remuneration, which is aligned with the needs of people and all the rest, but it's a discipline. Living wage means investing in people. It's not simply paying something to people. It's investing in people and enabling people to become so productive, to be able to access living wage, workers to be able to access living wage levels. This means investing in human capital, investing a lot in training. So wherever we work, as we work with independent artisans that set up through us their own cooperatives, and then they are connected together, as I said before, through the social enterprises, we have a huge program of capacity building and skills development and training for everybody. And this is a key component of the living wage. Then we do the calculation of the living wage. Living wage is a discipline that forces you to have a wage ladder. You start from the poverty level and you go above that, and then you go to the minimum salary, and then you go towards that. And in order to reach there, you have to enable people to be productive enough to arrive there. And you have to structure your business model in order to focus on this, to invest in this, and to enable people to do it. Then, as I said, we are a UN program, so our focus is regeneration of social capital in war and conflict-torn countries and in places of extreme poverty. So we have a very strong social impact assessment system. In the communities and in the places where we work, we have social workers that are detached from our production team, from our capacity building team. And these social workers have a baseline wherever we work. And then every season, every 6 months, they assess progress in social indicators against the benchmarks that we have and the baseline. So we have a very granular set of data on how we bring about social change where we work. And that's a key element of our social orientation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Riley, who'll ask our next question.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for being here, and I'm super lucky to be here. I'm a fashion and sustainability student at LIM, so this is really what I care about. And yeah, I'm super excited. I'll just jump right into my question. And I know we don't want to focus on the pandemic too much, but I think it's pretty hard for all of us to ignore the changes that it's brought. So how have recent events suggesting that the pandemic reshaped your work, and have you had to pivot in any way? So let's bring the world and the globe into our conversation, and let's start with Simone.
Mamma mia. Difficult one. So first of all, we started producing masks wherever we work. We have produced, in the first months, we have produced a million masks. And for the communities where we work, for our workers, but also for public bodies, for big companies, for other UN agencies who wanted to buy masks and who didn't find enough masks in the countries where we work. But most of all, we tried to reorganize our operations by agreeing with we are mainly a business to business thing that work with many fashion brands all over the world and distributors. So agreeing with them on the management of the orders in order to avoid huge disruptions. So to minimize these disruptions, we had some cancellation, we rescheduled some orders, we had some request of rescheduling payments, we tried to manage that. And while doing this, we took all our budgets for investment, which luckily we have, and we anticipated investments in capacity building and in training in places where we were losing orders and where we risked losing jobs. So we kept people, artisans busy with capacity building and with this kind of investment. We have quite a large investment capacity. So far, we've been able to minimize disruptions. What worries me is that the big disruptions are yet to come. We are going to see them from now on. And I'm very worried about that because we still have some investment capacity that takes us until the end of the year, but then we really need things to change, and I am not so optimistic about that. Then we also started working more on local and regional markets. We rediscovered some networks of distribution in the places where we work for products that are less expensive, products that are a bit more poor also, but for which there was still a demand. In these days, restructuring. I'm buying a Land Cruiser, a four-wheel drive, an old one, which I am transforming into a small truck to sell some of our fabric in that country, in some of the villages, around some of the villages where we work. We work more with local designers, and we also worked for some theatrical and film productions that needed to be done in order to manage the disruptions of the orders. So that's what we have done. In our system, we have created a new platform to manage our international capacity building work online, and we are also dealing with a major technology provider worldwide to stabilize this platform and to make it available also for our collaborators in the field. Of course, we have implemented, as I was saying before, this conference with Andreas and with Nancy, we are implementing also safety measures and things which we had already in place before, because in some of the places where we work, we had Ebola. And so we are accustomed to having this kind of protective measures.
Thank you. Avedis, do you want to take the next?
Sure, and welcome, Riley. It's awesome to see students get engaged in forums like this, and you know, I certainly miss my student days, and I have much more hope for the next generation, because these students are learning about these things in ways that we never had a chance to when we were in school. So this is a good thing. Yes, it is impossible to avoid the discussion of COVID and how it's changed the world, starting with the fact that we'd be doing this in person if it hadn't been for COVID, right? In terms of our work and how it's been impacted, I think Simone has highlighted some key areas. I won't go into too much depth there. We have certainly lost business in that sense. I mean, the world kind of ground to an economic slowdown for much of the second quarter. Fortunately, we did have some reserves and didn't need to lay off or furlough anybody on our staff. We've been able to stay busy. But the real problem was the bulk of the work that we do, as you heard me describe in the introduction, is conduct social audits. And we were not able to do that. You couldn't send somebody to a factory because travel was restricted, or because, you know, that just wasn't an option anymore. So we had to really pivot and determine how, if it was possible to do some assessments remotely. Can we certify working conditions without actually being there? And we made the decision that along the lines that Fatima mentioned, you know, that in-person presence is so critical. So for first-time factories, if you are new to our program, we were not going to be able to make any kind of assessment because we could not do any sort of credible statement without being there on site. But if you had been in the program for a while and you were up for renewal of your certification, we knew we'd been there before, we had a baseline, we were able to proceed with an alternative desktop assessment that looked at documents, looked at some video interviews, and gave us enough of a comfort level to extend the certificate, not issue a new one, but extend the certificate by 4 months, with the hope that by then, which is now the third quarter now, we'll be back to being able to be on site. So it's that kind of stuff, looking for technology solutions, remote solutions. The other thing that we do, as I mentioned, is there's an education component to our program. So a lot of trainings had to be postponed, outright canceled. So we've moved a lot of that online. We've been able to take advantage of Zoom and these kind of settings to be able to do, instead of in person, a live interactive but online version of the training. So that's the kind of stuff that has impacted us. But really from Simone's comments, I think the point that ought not to be lost is we talk of these changes somewhat now in the past tense, assuming things are now returning to normal. And I'm not sure that's ever going to happen. There are some real fundamental changes that have taken place that are yet to become clear to us. And these include, in my mind, long-term changes in demand patterns and just consumption patterns, right? Like everybody else, I've bought a bunch of nice new shirts these past few months. I haven't bought a single pair of new pants. Right? So there's a lot of movement in what is selling, comfort stuff, yoga stuff that's up, formal wear down. But in general, consumerism, we spent months indoors not shopping, and we've seemed to have survived. So is that going to be a permanent feature? Are we going to see a general decline in demand? Are we going to see categories that are no longer as viable? These are open questions, and they will have reverberations throughout the supply chain, including on the social compliance auditing side of things. So still a lot to be worked out.
Thank you. And Fatima?
Thank you, Riley, and thank you for that question. I want to break it up into two parts. One, what was already happening, and then the other part is what we've seen happen and some of the, I think, trigger responses that we need to be ready for. So what was already happening, I think, to Avedis' point, and I'm sorry if I just butchered your name a little bit right now, we've already seen a trend towards more minimalism, a decline in consumerism. So a lot of the manufacturers, especially the mid to large, because Bangladesh especially is more of a volume country. So they've opened up sample rooms where they're doing much smaller batch production. So in that sense, we were almost ready for this. And then on a day-to-day level, a lot of these factories have now pivoted to doing masks, or honestly also PPEs, the larger ones that can afford the raw materials. They're pivoting a little bit. So some of them are okay. And then overall, holistically, you now have temperature checks, you have a lot of different stations. So work has slowed down, number one. Productivity is 100% down. We are just slower. A lot of things now need to be aired, which they could have been sent by sea, because we are all running behind production schedule. It's just a fact of life. So it's had an environmental impact as well. And what's the most insidious part of this is that on the manufacturing and on my end, and I will admit to being part of this, is that when we set up contracts with our clients, we have our scope of work, we have our overall contracts, and it's usually a contract that's very protective of the client, the brand, the business. And usually we don't ever just sit and consult with a myriad of lawyers and say, how can we tweak the document to also really truly protect us? Many are not protected. So as a result of this, you've had a lot of situations where goods are approved and they're just not being accepted, or now we have to figure out a way to warehouse them, or they're just being canceled, and it's not canceled because of scope of work issue. So there needs to be some more coming together of brands and of manufacturers, because you know what, when business does resume, in whichever way it resumes, it is also part of your responsibility. We are actually part of your IP. We are also what make you great. We are the thing that makes your customers keep coming back. There needs to be some responsiveness in helping us survive this. So there's been a lot of media outcry, and some brands have come through, but to be completely honest with you, many have not. And if I am looking forward to the future, I mean, I'm an eternal optimist. I think that Bangladesh, South Asia has incredible potential. We want the work that maybe others are now too developed and where they have other industries developed where they may not necessarily want. We want that work. We want the opportunity to shine. And provided we can get through the next year and a half, because it's going to be painful, we are going to have several factory closures. And if we get through that, we will be okay. I want you to really understand what a factory closure means. You have thousands of people in there. They're not the most educated people. They're highly skilled, highly trained people who then tend to support their immediate families and maybe oftentimes larger communities. So if you have a factory shutdown of 3,000 people, you're not just firing 3,000 people, you're impacting 12 or 15,000 people if you really think about it in a family way. So the responsibility of that weighs very, very heavily on us. And we are starting to think about how do we proactively, moving forward with clients, protect ourselves a little more while still being incredibly inviting and bringing in business. And this is having an impact on us, and it is having an impact on some of the poorest people, some of the hardest working people in the world. So my hope, though, is that we will recover and we will have a booming industry. But I know that in the short run, there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering.
Thank you. You all made very good points, and I'm sorry to bring the conversation down a little negatively, but it is something that is just so big, and you all really took that question from a different angle, so I appreciate that. And I'm not sure if I'm handing over to Nancy or Austin, but thank you.
Yeah, actually, yeah, thank you, Riley. I agree. A really interesting conversation about that question. So before I turn it over to Austin and guest questions, I want to ask our panelists, and if you can answer sort of in a quick fire, 60-second answer. What would you say are some low-hanging fruit or a tangible way that a business could really embrace or become more ethical, socially compliant? So I am going to ask you to limit the answer to about 60 seconds or so, and then I will turn it over to Austin. So let's start with Fatima again. Hopefully I gave you a little chance to take a glass of water.
No, it's completely okay. Rapid fire. If you can afford it, work with someone, work with some of these organizations, even such as mine, and really try and enter the right way. It's much easier to enter and then have a bird's eye view of what the problem is and then try and work together to fix it versus being in the midst of a supply chain and then trying to move and shift, because it's a big wieldy system and it's really, really tough. So these are the core things you need to ask. Even before sustainability, you need to ask, are your workers safe? Are they getting paid? Do they have the right to unionize? What is the turnover rate for your facility? What is your cancellation rate? That's number one. Then number two, you then should take a deep dive into their compliance certifications. And then if that all aligns with what they're saying, that's another checkpoint. Then third, go visit your facility. Now, if you're working with a much smaller facility because compliance certifications are expensive, that's okay. Then you have to really at least go download what these compliance certifications should be, create your own guideline, and then start asking those questions. Created in a contractual way. So therefore, if someone is not being completely upfront, there's penalties associated with that. So I would say that's a really good way to basically get started. But even before you think about sustainability, think about the actual human beings who are touching your products.
I think some of our guests were probably writing down some of those bullet points. Thank you so much, Fatima. Simone, I'll turn it to you for your 60 seconds.
But rather similar to Fatima, be sure labor standards are applied in the whole of your supply chain. Don't just take for granted that you pass them to the first tier of your subcontractors, and don't take for granted that they trickle down to all the other tiers, because they do not. So know your supply chain, be sure they are applied everywhere. Go to Avedis and get them certified in a proper way. And where this compliance is not envisaged by local law, where there are elements that are missing, missing, be sure you put them in place. There's the case of a very well-known African country for the leather industry where the local labor law doesn't envisage a minimum salary, a minimum wage. And in this case, there are companies that say, okay, we do not pay it, but there are also companies, international companies, that say, so we pay a good salary because we implement a calculation, we calculate the living wage, and we decide what's a good remuneration of labor on the basis of living wage standards. So know your supply chain, all the tiers, be sure you know, be sure your subcontractors show to you where they subcontract the things, know what are the labor standards there, apply international labor standards, and be sure you do it. It's business model changing, because the cost of goods sold is more expensive. The operational margin is lower in accounting terms, but then you have to make provision for it.
Thank you. And Avedis, I'll go to you.
Thank you, Nancy. I think Fatima and Simone have given really good practical advice, and I certainly endorse going to RAP as part of the solution as in that advice. So I'll use my 60 seconds to give more of a philosophical answer to the question, what should you do to improve? Really, it is a question of approaching it with the right attitude. Far too often, you have factories and buyers thinking about compliance as a cost, right? And so if you think of something as a cost, you naturally think about minimizing it. Right? The thing to do is to think about it as an investment, because you will get a return for it. And if you start shifting your mindset towards investment thinking, then whatever you're spending isn't viewed as something that you have to minimize, but rather ask yourself what you're getting in return for it. And then you might actually end up be willing to spend more because you're getting more of a return. That's what I would advise. And the way to get to that thinking is really not be short term in your vision, but longer term in seeing your business over the span of time, not just from this quarter to the next. Right now, that's difficult because we're struggling. It's a real crunch economically, but the people that are going to be successful are the ones who are going to see this long-term and recognize compliance for the investment that it is and not think of it as a cost.
Thank you. Great answers. Thank you. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Austin Sierra to field some audience questions.
Of the room. So, reiterate myself. My name is Austin Sierra. I'm a fashion merchandising major at LAM College, sustainability minor, and I like to consider myself a designer. I like to design circular systems and really multi-purpose clothing. But with that being said, I wanted to field the first question towards Fatima. I have a question asking if you only work with large US brands or small to medium brands in other locations around the world.
Great question. Bulk of my clients are mid-sized brands, and that's really my sweet spot. The larger brands, honestly, they have really intricate and very set supply chains, and it's very difficult to move them away from that unless, say, there's a huge shift in duty penalties or something happens, and that's when they're willing to really reconsider and look at maybe their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I don't really deal with anything below that. And so a bulk of my clients are mid-sized, and I've been lately taking on more of the smaller clients, the higher end clients, because we're now experimenting with sample rooms and such. And as long as the margins work and as long as we're all transparent, I think it's fine. When I'm working with Bangladesh, for instance, right, we are a primarily cut and sew country. So our carbon footprint is really low. But the one really good thing about this particular manufacturing hub is that the workers are really experienced in procuring raw materials. So it gives you a level of oversight into your business that may be hard in other countries because we're open and transparent about it, and we can come and bring you a lot of different options. So, in a roundabout way, yes, with a lot of different types and sizes of clients.
Incredible. And now I want to open the floor to everyone else, and kind of similar format, going towards a rapid fire, if you can answer within 60 seconds. I know this is a heavy question, but a lot of people tend to ask it. When you're looking towards factories and companies, it's up to their morals to really step forward and make the right decisions. But do you think compliance and sustainable practices has to be government mandated, or should it stay towards companies pick and choose if they want to comply?
I am a UN officer, and as the chair of the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, there are things that are part of the law and that have to be envisaged in the law and that are envisaged by the law. And a legislative framework is always important for everything, Whenever there is compliance, right, a good legislative framework is extremely important. The important thing is that the law is enforced, because there are many countries with a good legislative framework and law is not enforced. And it's the case of many countries that could have decent working conditions and do not have them because of that. Then there are the voluntary form of engagement. And as Avedis rightly said, they are investments in the productivity of the company, but they are also an investment in operational hedging against the risk of non-compliance. The reputational risk coming from non-compliance is huge and is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So the way to hedge against that is not to buy a derivative, because it's not possible, but it's to structure your operations in such a way that they are ethical and that they are socially sustainable. This means also intervening in the way in which the margins are generated, because it's a matter of business modeling. The moment in which you apply standards, legislation, and which you engage, your cost of goods sold changes. So the operational margin changes. And so all the margins down. If you look at the balance sheet, you go to yahoo.com, yahoo.finance.com, and you look at the financials of the big groups, you see big part of the margins that are in the middle, after the cost of goods sold, after the operational margin, because there are all the things about marketing, retail, It's about restructuring these margins. This year, in October, we celebrate 10 years of collaboration with Vivienne Westwood. Every single season, a whole collection with them. They restructure their margins in order to work with us and to allow and to increase the cost of goods sold for them, but to allow us to implement good standards and to charge good prices for our products.
I have very mixed feelings about this. So on a base level, the government needs to, and I'll just give a really practical answer from my experience. I think the two things the government needs to protect, regardless of what country you're in, especially if you're a democracy, it's minimum wages and it's the right to unionize. Those are non-negotiable. Beyond that, in the models, oh my God, Simone, when you were talking, I'm like, that's correct, because I really don't want the government to get that heavily involved. Of course, there's many different specialties in our government, but really understanding the intricacies of business and modeling and our margins is not necessarily something that I think is where their expertise lies. I think it should be heavily encouraged. So as opposed to penalties, if someone is doing something right, then maybe you reward them, and maybe that becomes more of a global effort. But when you penalize, because there could be really specific reasons why certain things are being done or not done, and you could be in a cash crunch, you may have lost a client, you could be in survival mode, and that one additional penalty could be sort of the nail in the coffin, so to speak. And I don't want to see businesses go out of business, out of what they're doing. I want to see them encouraged and empowered. And that really comes from people like Avedis, Simone, a lot of the other folks that I know who are voluntarily on bodies such as ITAC 13 and different types of government bodies, where they can inform legislation and then reward and set up investment in infrastructure and encouraging that movement forward, never ever penalizing, because that requires a level of understanding of business margins that I'm not comfortable necessarily saying the government has.
We are in agreement. The point on legislation is international covenants are part of the legislation of every single country. So the international covenants of the International Labour Office, for instance, they have to be part of the legislation. And that's negotiable, as you say. I agree with you. Then the rest, I completely agree with you.
No, absolutely. I think, as usual, Simone and Fatima have given great responses, so I have nothing to add there. All I will do is look at it from a different angle and say the attractiveness, like you said, Austin, this question gets asked a lot, and the attractiveness of a legislative solution to a layperson is easy to understand. But remember, any law, no matter how well researched, no matter how well intentioned, at the time of being passed, cannot possibly countenance every scenario in which it might or might not be applicable. So that sets you up for failure in one of two paths, right? Either you're too broad in your scope and are having consequences that were not meant to be in place by the law, or too narrowly designed and you're missing out on stuff that you're going to want to include. So that's one problem with a legislative solution. The other problem, to the points that were being made already, is that if you have a law, you must necessarily enforce it, right? And that's an expensive proposition. You've got to find the bad guys, prosecute them, bring them to justice, all of which is not easy in any government, let alone the weaker resourced governments in some of the countries where sourcing is the predominant manufacturing is the predominant industry. So you want frameworks, as Simone said, and as Fatima pointed out, you want that, but you also need to recognize that you are better off achieving the ends you want by fostering voluntary and positive reward mechanisms, because then you're going to get people doing things that you want them to do because they want to do it, not because they have to do it by law. So it's an alluring attraction, but legislative solutions are generally not going to be as effective long-term as a properly set up reward mechanism on using business levers.
Thank you all for your amazing answers. And I know this question heavily weighed on me as well, so it's incredible to hear from all industry leaders on how they felt about the topic. And as of right now, I would like to hand it back over to Nancy Miller, if you would like to take it away. Once again, thank you guys so much for having me.
Sure. Since Riley and I have been alternating, I want to give Riley the opportunity to ask a question to our panelists. So I'll shoot it right over to Riley.
Thank you. So for this last question, we wanted it to be a little bit more individual. And the question is, what trends are you seeing? What do you see in the future? So what are you kind of currently working on? What changes do you think are going to happen in this segment? And Avedis, we know that you recently published, or RAP recently published, the Symphonization, I believe was the title. Yes. So we would love to, if you would like to start off with telling us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, thank you, Riley. Yes. In June, we put out this white paper called Symphonization. It's a made-up term, and it really is our idea for a new sort of post-pandemic paradigm for supply chain social compliance management. We've talked about how much of a crisis this is, and we're all suffering through it, and we're still not done. But every crisis does present an opportunity. I mean, there's always that silver lining to look for, as Fatima said, eternal optimists out there. And we believe that this is a chance for us to rethink, reset the way we approach social compliance, moving away from the old paradigm, which really was, again, to Fatima's point, right? Different brands, each promulgating their own independent codes and having multiple audits done at factories, resulting in audit fatigue and no real progress, to a more unified approach where you recognize that there are a handful of independent organizations out there, like RAP, but we're not the only one. There are peers out there that can provide that same service far more credibly and in a way that's actually going to be much more efficient. So have buyers move away from that old way of everyone doing their own thing and creating audit fatigue to a universe where you have a menu of options that can then create a viable solution for the brands and a much more efficient approach from the factory's point of view to reduce audit fatigue and have a more credible way forward. There's a lot of details in there that I know we're probably not going to be able to address here, but happy to share the paper with anyone who wants to learn more about it. And thank you for the opportunity to bring that up, Riley.
Thank you so much. And Fatima, we would love to hear what's new in Bangladesh.
Thank you. So I think there's a couple of different ways that it can go. We can really see a shift in the client base. We can see more smaller, mid-sized brands coming into Bangladesh, really seeing the sample size, sample room model really take off. And then also, but I can't really quite answer this without sort of answering what I expect to see in the United States. I do expect on some level to see a little less consumerism and then therefore a little more lean into where and how their products are being made. But I also think we're going to see a lot of emphasis on fast fashion and discounted brands as well, because we are going through an incredibly hard economic time and purchase will not stop. So you're going to really see a lot of traction in those brands. So we're going to have to really wait out and see which fight wins the war, really the hearts and minds of consumers. But on our back end, we are ready. We've had to make these changes regardless. So what I'm really hoping to see is that we have more influx of business there. We have more real conversations about what sourcing countries are really like with our warts and all, and working together to maybe move towards a better system.
Thank you. And Simone?
We spoke a lot about this also in our podcast on the social platform of the Ethical Fashion Initiative. But I would like here to say something very personal. I'm afraid the global supply chain of this industry is getting a bit restructured, reoriented. There is more importance is coming up on regional supply chains that are then integrated among them. So we have always a global vision, but with more importance at the regional level, as Fatima was saying, the sample rooms closer to where you make the things, blah, 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 blah. And we'll see product development centers and the relationship in between PD centers and where production takes place a bit more different. We'll see more focus on regional markets. We'll see a higher focus on consumers, because I agree with Fatima and with Avedis. Consumerism is being reshaped. Unfortunately, in some of the places where we work, we also see more war, more conflict, and more poverty, because the world is getting poorer and international bodies have less money. Governments are curtailing investment in peacekeeping operations, in aid for development and for humanitarian aid. And so we will see some of the places where we work with a very bad worsening situation in terms of conflict, security, and the rise in the international terrorism, especially in some places in the Sahel, in the Middle East, because international terrorism benefits of this decreased attention in development and of the general troubles of the world. So we'll see some very bad moments, and we'll see also, and that's bad, a threat, a growing threat on democracy and internationalism and international liberalism as we have known it. And this is bad. It's all linked, and it's part of a trend which makes the world in which we live, at least in the short term, more dangerous and more difficult. But we are all here to engage together to counter that and to work all together to make things different. And that's why the work of Fatima, the work of Avedis, and your studies are so important. And this kind of initiatives like this webinar are so important to spread the awareness of that.
Thank you. That was a great note to end it on, I think. We are getting to that time, so I just want to thank you all for being here with me, and I'm going to pass it over to Andrea.
Thank you all so much. Wow, what a, all three of you and your final answers were really inspirational. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much, Avedis, Simone, and Fatima, for sharing your knowledge and time and work with everyone. Thank you, Nancy Miller, Riley Bott, and Austin Sierra, for your great questions. And then please join us on week 12 at the Fashion and Sustainability Summit, where we'll have a conversation on transparency, traceability, and accountability, and the technologies that will help you get there, with Suchi Ramesh from Suchi Inc., Leonardo Bonanni from SourceMap, Ilka Jordan from Jordan Alliance Group, and Michelle Eileen, the founder and fashion strategist at M Shop NYC. Joining us as co-moderators will be Madison Ross, LIM alum, and Rebecca Margolis from Fashion Dex and LIM College. And I want to give a big shout out again and thank you so much to Echo Life Yarns, Candor Textiles, and the Accessories Council for sponsoring the Fashion and Sustainability Summit. In 2 weeks, please come back where we'll have a conversation on sustainability at Allbirds, and that's on October 1st. And please check out LAM College where business meets fashion and fashiondex.com. And perhaps if you need a sustainable source, you'll look on the website. So thank you, and we wish you all a sustainable week.